Welcome into Real Pod Wednesdays. Dan Hope joined by Andy Anders. The transfer portal is now closed, and Ohio State didn't have anyone enter who it was really counting on or who it should be particularly surprised or devastated to lose. Ohio State did have 6 players enter the transfer portal post-spring, but none of those players were expected to play major roles for the Buckeyes this year. Dallan Hayden, probably the biggest name among that group. He told the coaches that he would be entering the portal before spring was even over. The other 5 players to leave for the portal after spring practices are wide receiver Kyion Grayes, guard Enokk Vimahi, linebacker Nigel Glover, safety Jihad Carter, safety Cedrick Hawkins. Andy, I think with that list of players, I think we can say that this post-spring transfer window in terms of roster retention went about as well as Ohio State could have hoped.
Yeah, I'd call it a complete success. The only Jihad Carter might have gotten in for some mop-up duty or whatever, but there's nobody, like you said, that is a major contributor to this team that they lost in the post-spring window. And I think based off what was kind of said nationally, what was, this was supposed to be this hectic, kind of window compared to last year. You certainly have to like that as a Buckeye fan, that they didn't lose any major pieces to this post-spring window. And I think that it's the next step to building for what this team wants to accomplish for the fall. Now, you could look and say, hey, didn't really add anybody this spring window. Didn't add anyone at all as of yet. Still could look at some additions, and the position we've talked about a lot upgrading is along that offensive line, whether that be offensive guard or maybe getting a tackle so that you could slide someone else in, whatever that may be. But really, no good options have emerged, and so now you're wondering, you have 5 scholarships available. Well, do you go out and pursue maybe some depth in some areas? There are some positions that might make sense for that, just adding a depth piece. But I liked a lot where this roster stood coming out of spring, maybe outside again of offensive line in some spots. And you can sit here after the spring and say, after the transfer window rather, and say, yeah, still like where it's at, still like where this team is heading.
Yeah, no news is good news for Ohio State in this transfer portal cycle. It's a net positive for the Buckeyes if there was not a lot of transfer movement elsewhere, because coming out of spring, I think we certainly would have felt Ohio State maybe is the best roster in the country. If not, it's probably the second best roster right up there with Georgia. And you didn't see anybody else get demonstrably better so far in the transfer portal. I mean, we've seen Miami add a few pieces, but they're not in the same echelon right now as an Ohio State in terms of overall talent. You look at the teams that you expect to be the major contenders for the national championship this year. To their end, none of them really lost a whole lot either, because as you said, this post-spring transfer window proved to be very overhyped nationally. I mean, I don't think there was one player that entered the transfer portal post-spring that if you just asked the average college football fan would know that that player entered the portal. Like, the December transfer window was quite a scene with the amount of notable players who changed teams. But this post-spring window was pretty much a nothing burger in terms of impact. I mean, I think actually last year's post-spring transfer window might have been more eventful than this year's. And so, again, a good thing all in all for Ohio State. Certainly, they have 5 scholarships available, so you'd imagine they're going to try to add, a few more pieces here. But I don't think it's particularly likely that Ohio State is going to add anyone in the transfer portal at this point who's going to come in and be a major impact player for the Buckeyes. And to your point, there's really only one position where they would even need or be looking for that kind of player, and that would be if they could get a right guard. I just don't know right now if that guy's out there. If, maybe there's a guy out there that you can bring in to compete for a job, but I don't think there's an offensive lineman available in the portal right now who you can bring in and is going to be that plug and play, surefire upgrade at right guard, which I think is what they were hoping for. But, the reality is in the transfer portal, you're at the mercy of what happens elsewhere. And so, they may need to, just roll with the guys they have and have a competition there. The good news is, because you didn't lose anyone from that offensive line except for Enokk Vimahi, who, realistically, although he started at right guard in the Cotton Bowl, was not going to be a factor in that competition. We didn't see him get many reps this spring. He's a guy going into his 6th year that, we just really hadn't seen much of anything from to indicate that he was going to be a realistic option for playing time this year. And so, that competition was largely between Luke Montgomery and Carson Hinsman and Tegra Shabola this spring. And I think all three of those guys, unless Ohio State can find somebody who it thinks is a clear upgrade at right guard, I think those three guys are likely going to compete for that job throughout preseason camp. And the competition is also going to continue at quarterback throughout preseason camp. And I think that's probably the biggest takeaway from this post-spring transfer window, is the fact that Ohio State still has all 5 of its scholarship quarterbacks on this roster, because I don't think really anybody was expecting that going into the post-spring transfer window. I mean, even among sources we talked to close to the program, there was an expectation that they were going to lose at least one quarterback in this post-spring transfer window. There were fears that Ohio State could lose 2 or even 3 quarterbacks in the post-spring transfer window. Instead, all 5 quarterbacks chose to stay. And that gives Ohio State, while we don't necessarily know who the starter is going to be yet, while we don't necessarily know how good that starter is going to be yet, Ohio State's quarterback depth is truly ideal. And it's going to be the envy of the country, because we've heard Ryan Day talk about wanting to have 4 scholarship quarterbacks and how much harder it is to have 4 scholarship quarterbacks in the current college football climate. But this year he's going to have 5.
Yeah, coming out of spring, for me, I know, and I think a lot of us that cover the team, it was not if they were going to lose a quarterback, it was how many. And so to see them lose none, I think is a testament to what is built in the program, the roster retention skills of Ryan Day, of Chip Kelly, are to keep these pieces on board. Even maybe a testament to where Ohio State's NIL is at, that they were able to get all these guys to stay. I mean, that's always a factor behind the scenes these days, right? And so now you have all this depth and a really healthy competition going into the fall, which, we still expect to really play out between Will Howard and Devin Brown. But to have those guys stick around even for maybe 2025 and having some competition for next year after, Howard's gone, he'll have exhausted his eligibility. Who knows with Devin Brown? Who knows with anybody after this season? But he'll even have some healthy competition for 2025 because you're keeping all of these pieces in the room. Back to additions, looking at what could still be added through the portal. It's, again, to your point, Dan, there's really no one out there. Just looking at the 24/7 Sports transfer portal rankings, only I believe it's 2 of the top 50. Yes, 2 of the top 50, double checking that right now, transfer portal prospects that aren't committed already to go to other schools. So there isn't a lot of talent. Neither of those are offensive linemen, by the way. So if you were looking for a starter and to fill that right guard spot, that's the spot that, again, you would want to upgrade at. If you were going to upgrade a spot for Ohio State, there's just no option out there that, even if you could have your pick of the litter, is going to give you a better shot, I think, than Luke Montgomery or Tegra Shabola developing into that starting caliber guy, or Carson Hinsman, whoever that might be. Enokk Vimahi, someone you root for. I've said this in the past. I think it was what happened in Hawaii and using his platform to raise disaster relief aid this past fall. Enokk's someone who is someone you admire as a person, but he was never going to play here this year. Wasn't involved in the competition as a sixth-year guy. And, in that Cotton Bowl, really, he didn't have the look of someone who was capable of starting at Ohio State, certainly, or even any other Big Ten school, really. Not to dog too much on the guy, but it made a lot of sense for this move, and I think that's the case with all of these transfers. As we've said, I don't want to circle back too much though to cover again what they could add in the portal. You're again looking at depth pieces, and the two positions that make the most sense are probably safety and running back. Safety, outside, you go past Caleb Downs and Lathan Ransom, who are going to be your two starters at that deep safety position. You have Malik Hartford, who did some nice things as a freshman. I think you're really high on him coming into his second year. Outside of that, there's really no proven out assets deep for Ohio State with Jahad Carter's departure, who, even though he didn't contribute hardly at all last year, was the 3-year starter at Syracuse. So that's a position where if you could go get a guy that is willing to come in and be a second teamer, just provide depth behind the top of the rotation, you do it. And then the same is true at running back, where you have probably the best 1-2 punch in the country with Travion Henderson and Quinshon Judkins, but you lost the number 3 behind those guys at Dallan Hayden, and now your next 3 options are freshman walk-on. I'm high on TC Caffey and I'm high on James Peoples, but I think you'd like to have a third guy, because injuries happen in this running back room all the time. They have over the past few years. You'd like to have a third guy that you trust and know can take care of the football in high leverage situations.
Yeah, I think those are the most likely areas where if Ohio State was going to look for a depth piece, those are probably the ones that would make the most sense. I mean, you look across this roster as a whole, because of the lack of post-spring transfer departures. I mean, this roster really is going to be one of the deepest rosters in college football. We mentioned the quarterback depth really stands out. I think the defensive line depth really stands out. I mean, you've got a lot of guys there. Caden Curry and Kenyatta Jackson, Hero Canoe, Caden McDonald. I mean, those guys are good enough to start at most schools, and that's going to be your second team defensive line at Ohio State. And so the defensive line depth is loaded. I mean, the cornerback depth is loaded. I mean, you've got 9 scholarship guys there, and I think most of those guys would be starting at a lot of schools this year. I mean, they're loaded at that position. I think, most positions across the board, they're where they need to be in terms of depth. And again, that's a testament to the roster retention of Ohio State. And, now we can say that, because I remember, this coming up earlier in the spring where you talked about the depth of a roster. It was kind of like, well, let's wait and see, because there was a possibility they could lose a bunch of those guys to the transfer portal, and then they wouldn't have had that depth. But now you really can sit here and say you feel really good about the depth of this roster. Yeah, you'd like to have another veteran safety. Yeah, you'd like to have another running back on scholarship who's not a freshman. But I think the thing that you then have to look at is, okay, who can we get who actually wants to be here to be that kind of depth player? That becomes the challenge, because most guys in the transfer portal are looking for more playing time. And outside of an offensive lineman, that's not something Ohio State is going to be able to offer most transfers. And so, if you can find a guy that, hey, he just wants to be part of a potential national championship team, and, maybe he's a younger guy with the potential to develop into a starter in the future, and he's willing to come in and be a backup this year, great, go get that guy. If the only guys you can get are not better than Inky Jones and TC Caffey, then you might as well just give those guys the scholarships. You don't want to add just for the sake of adding. When you have 5 scholarships available, you should certainly be looking at what's out there and trying to find guys who can help your team. But I don't necessarily expect that Ohio State is going to add 5 guys just because it has 5 scholarships available, because I don't know if there's going to be 5 guys out there based on who's entered the portal nationwide, who are going to be really worth giving a scholarship to now, especially if it means, for multiple years in the future.
Yeah, and with 5 available, I mean, I don't think there's certainly 5 needs that you could list that Ohio State needs to fill. I think it would warrant scholarships for Caffey and Inky Jones. Those are 2 guys who have been really dedicated walk-ons for this program for multiple years. And frankly, just in the spots we saw him, I thought Inky Jones looked kind of good in the spring. I thought that you sometimes write off walk-ons as depth pieces, but we've seen in the past, Xavier Johnson, case in point, that they can turn into good high-level contributors just because you didn't come in on scholarship. Diamonds in the rough are found all the time in college football. This is something that can happen, and I think Inky Jones has been a valuable special teams contributor now for a while. This is a guy you should reward with a scholarship, I think, and you have 5 available. They could still go out if some guard is found at the last minute to have entered the portal, I guess, or whatever. You could still add an offensive lineman, a safety, and even another running back, and still reward those 2 guys with scholarships. It's not a huge deal, obviously, in terms of whether they're going to win a national title or not, and they're still going to have both those guys on the roster. But it's just something cool you'd like to see Ohio State do, is reward those walk-ons with scholarships because of what they've meant to the program, just in the ways they've contributed to TC Caffey going through what he's gone through in terms of injuries and things of that nature.
And it's always a good thing for team culture too, when you're rewarding guys who have proven they can play, that they belong at Ohio State. I think there's going to be if you ever players on the team would be very excited to see a couple of those guys get scholarships if they are available, to reward them for the work that they've put in. And I think it shows too when you do that. It could show, all the walk-ons, all the players on the team that, hey, if you put in the work, you will get recognized, you will get noticed. So, we'll see. A lot of times Ohio State will quietly give a scholarship to a walk-on and they don't even announce it. Some schools will do the big reveals on social media. Ohio State generally hasn't done that. They've generally just kind of quietly given those scholarships to guys who are deserving. And so, we'll see what Ohio State ultimately does there. But again, I think the important thing out of all this is Ohio State did not lose anybody over the last couple of weeks who was expected to play a substantial role on this team this year. And that's what really matters, because this is right now a championship caliber roster. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to win a championship, but the pieces are there. There's still some questions to answer. They got to find that 5th starter on the offensive line. They've got to find that starting quarterback. The rest of the starters on that offensive line have to be better than they were last year. But the pieces are in place for Ohio State to make a run at all of its goals this year. And I think the only thing that was going to really derail that was if they had major losses in the post-spring transfer window, which did not happen.
Yeah, I'd say it was a successful football transfer window just in terms of not losing any key pieces. As we've said before, it's just not the craziness that was expected coming into this window. And I think I was optimistic that Ohio State could retain a lot of pieces. I didn't think it would be this much, just considering the quarterback position and what they didn't lose from that quarterback room. Basketball side of things, last few weeks have been not too great for the Buckeyes. When you talk about, obviously, we've already discussed the losses of Roddy Gale, of Felix Okpara to the portal, but they've lost out on some major targets the last few weeks. Trey Townsend to Arizona, that was a guy, it was between Ohio State and Arizona. I thought the scoring threat, the rebounding, even the defense, the passing was one of the most versatile and complete assets Ohio State could have added through the portal. They were right on the doorstep, but he ends up going to Arizona. And you also lose out on the other guy who was kind of the top target alongside Townsend at that power forward position, trying to replace some of Jamison Battle's scoring production, and in this case, shooting production, because the one thing Townsend didn't do was shoot the 3-ball, was Tucker Anderson, went to Utah State. And so the other major target, Toby Awaka, also went to Arizona. Someone they were looking at out of Tennessee. Could have been a little Yankee swap between Felix Okpara and Toby Awaka, Ohio State and Tennessee kind of thing there at the forward position. But those guys are now off the board. And so the transfer portal options have thinned over the past few weeks for Ohio State, and they still have 2 scholarships available, and they need to add scoring production in the front court. Like, you've lost, Parra gave you some scoring. Obviously, Jamison Battle is the big loss with what he provided as a sharpshooter, one of the more prolific 3-point shootings really in Ohio State history, with 3-point shooting seasons. And also just a complete scorer, too, what he did getting to the line and making free throws in some clutch moments down the stretch of the year, what he did even on the interior, kind of some of the mid-range games, some of the transition game. There were a lot of things that Battle provided to this offense that they haven't replaced yet in the portal. Devin Royal might be able to step up and fill some of those needs coming into next year, but the problem is now that you need someone who can at least complement Royal and get you some of that scoring production. Duke Sean Stewart has emerged as the top target at this point. You'd say he was finalizing a visit with Ohio State as of April 24th. That visit, I believe, has taken place this week. So you see reports out there, not always from the most worthwhile sources, but he was supposed to take a visit this week, so you assume he's taking a visit this week, because that much was confirmed. So they're going to have to win a battle for him. That's a major, he was a 5-star prospect, and they did get another 5-star prospect in Aaron Bradshaw before, but winning a battle for Sean Stewart, you're going to have to beat out Georgetown, you're going to have to beat out UConn, you're going to have to beat out some really good teams. Sorry, not UConn. Cincinnati. I don't know how I got those confused. Cincinnati is also in the mix there, it seems. So there's a lot of competition for his services, but this is a guy who broke Zion Williamson's vertical leap record at Duke. I mean, talk about an athlete. Didn't really play a lot last year, only 8 minutes per game, but even as a shot blocker and rebounder, there are things he can provide. And that would be an absolute home run if Ohio State could get it, I think, just in terms of his ceiling, his potential coming in. And that would kind of shape a front court identity of young, high potential guys between he, Royal, and Bradshaw. So that's something you kind of like. The other names that they've reached out to, you have Kris Parker. I don't think that's one that there's really been a lot of ties to, and he's not been there's not been a lot out there about Kris Parker's recruitment, which is odd. Maybe because he wasn't a highly touted high school prospect and didn't really play for Alabama. But it's an interesting guy, 6'9", was a guard for Alabama last year, redshirted, but also obviously at that length has the capability to play forward, and Jake Diebler really values versatility in his roster construction. So that's an intriguing piece there. And then the 2 most recent guys they reached out to over the past few days are San Diego State forward Elijah Saunders and Bellarmine forward Langdon Hatton. Another 2. Both those players are kind of they'd be solid additions. I don't think they'd be on the level of Sean Stewart. So I think Sean Stewart's the guy that you've got to push all the chips into the middle of the table with and try to get, and then you still have one more spot to go out and try to add after that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to cast somewhat of a net here, because if you miss out on Sean Stewart, the options really start to dwindle, and they certainly need at least one guy. I mean, I think they really need 2 guys, but they certainly need to add at least one guy to that front court. And so They have to be exploring all their options. It's a little bit of a different situation than where we're at with football in terms of, they've got a few scholarships left, but, they can really get away with not necessarily adding any more impact players through a transfer portal. I think this Ohio State basketball team still needs, really two more guys who can come in and contribute this year, because I think you have a few guys on scholarship that we don't expect to play major roles this season. And if you don't add a couple pieces here, then those guys are going to be thrust into bigger roles. And so, I think if Ohio State can land Sean Stewart, that would be a big win for the Buckeyes. Who might get that other spot? It's hard to say. I mean, you would still think that this Ohio State team would want another true center to back up Aaron Bradshaw, but there hasn't really been any clear targets to emerge there since Felix Okpara left.
No, that's the position where there hasn't been a lot of movement. Now, there's some things, again, that I think Sean Stewart, they're really looking for someone to provide rebounding and shot blocking, right? And you can get that out of a guy who maybe has a little more flexibility between the power forward and center spot. I think their options are a little more wide there. But to your point, I don't think anyone really has emerged yet that has that swing capability between the 4 and the 5. I do think there's some things, again, that Sean Stewart can provide as a rebounder and shot blocker. I think Elijah Saunders kind of has some things. I think mainly it's Langdon Hatton's, 6'10", and could provide some of that. But you don't have a clear-cut target right now. And really, it's been a little while that they haven't seemed to have, like Jonas Idu from Tennessee. I'm not sure exactly how much they were really in that mix. There were some connections drawn there, but felt like maybe they were more going after Toby Awaka before he went to Arizona, right? So there just haven't been any targets to emerge yet at that center spot, and it is a spot that needs filled. They need more rebounding and shot blocking. Just like you'd like to see whatever power forward they sign be someone who's capable of shooting the 3 ball. Which, if you could get, I've said it before, I said it as it related to Trey Townsend, if you can get a good enough player in a ton of other areas, I think you figure it out later in terms of the shooting. You get the best player you can, and then you work out the nuts and bolts later. I think Sean Stewart's kind of a cut above the other targets right now. Literally didn't attempt a 3 last year. So if you can get him, you get him, and you worry about the 3-point shooting later. But if you're looking at 2 guys that you're kind of like, weighing between, you lean toward the 3-point shooting at that power forward position, and you need that other forward that can give you the rebounding and shot blocking. I think that's the other side of this. It's been made clear just by people close to the program that I've talked to, even that those are the 2 targets right now. Even if we haven't seen as much emerge in terms of guys they're going after for that latter person who is just a big rebounding shot blocking rebound presence. That's the word, Dan. Presence, not process. Got the 76ers on the mind, I guess. That rebounding shot blocking presence, no one really emerged there yet that can fill that sort of center role.
2024 NFL draft took place last week, and we knew it wouldn't be the most prolific draft for Ohio State, but it was a little smaller than even we expected, with only 4 Buckeyes getting drafted. Marvin Harrison Jr., as expected, went to the Arizona Cardinals with the number 4 overall pick, a pretty easy and obvious choice for the Cardinals there, and an obvious fit for him. Mike Hall getting to stay in the state of Ohio and play for his hometown team as the Cleveland Browns drafted him in round 2. That one felt like an obvious match if he was there in the second round, and the Browns made it happen. So cool for him that he will get the opportunity to play for the team that he grew up rooting for. Cade Stover fell a little bit further than expected to round 4, but I think ending up in a really good spot as he goes to the Houston Texans, which means he will be catching passes from CJ Stroud and Cade had said at the NFL Combine that, it would be an honor if he had the opportunity to reunite with CJ Stroud and play with him. And with that coming to fruition, I think is certainly an exciting thing for both of those guys. They were close friends during their time together at Ohio State. And so certainly I'm sure that CJ is happy to have Cade there with him in Houston. And you would think that he's someone that is going to look Cade's way when Cade is on the field as a pass catching target. And then rounding out the draft class for the Buckeyes was Tommy Eichenberg, who also fell a little bit further than expected, but lands in a good spot, I think, in round 5 with the Las Vegas Raiders, who don't have a lot of linebacker depth. And so he could have the opportunity to be the top backup there. I think, at least for me, the most surprising guy to go undrafted was Josh Proctor. You had said last week you thought my 5th round projection on Josh Proctor was a little generous, and that did prove to be the case as he went undrafted. But I think even you thought that he would still get drafted at some point.
Yeah, I had said, I think he would be a steal in either the 6th or 7th round for a team. And that didn't come to fruition. I was kind of surprised by that, just based on his production, his athleticism, his knowledge of the game that's developed, and really his maturity that's developed over what was a 6-year career at Ohio State. I think there were a lot of positive qualities for NFL teams to look at and want to draft Josh Proctor. Only 4 guys drafted, rarity for Ohio State. You talk about fit, though. I think each of these guys landed at a great spot. Marvin Harrison Jr. was going to fit in anywhere, so I don't think that's much of a concern with him. He's going to be one of the best receivers in the NFL in short order, I think, over the next few years. That's where he's been projected for a while now. I don't see any reason why that doesn't ultimately happen with Marvin's work ethic, his supreme talent, all those things. Cade Stover is, I think, the benefit not just is that, he's reunited with Stroud. He gets to learn behind a veteran in Dalton Schultz at the tight end position who's been doing this a while. And I think Cade is willing to sit back and learn and refine the parts of his game that need refining, especially on the blocking side, the inconsistencies that were there. Not to say that he didn't have good moments as a blocker. I think his struggles as a blocker, for me personally, were overblown a little bit at times. He did have definitely whiffs on plays that needed correcting, but he also had good blocks that sprang touchdowns this year. There was a lot of good and bad, so I think you need to kind of filter out the bad if you're Cade as a blocker, and that's, he's going to try and be that second tight end when the Texans want to go 12 personnel and have to fulfill some of those blocking duties early in his career because Dalton Schultz is on the roster. So those opportunities to develop, I think, will be really good for Cade and his long-term NFL future. I think Tommy Eichenberg as a Raider makes all the sense in the world. I wrote a story this morning on 11 Warriors talking about, you talk about the silver and black, the legends, the physical, just hard-nosed legends that have played there, whether it's Jim Otto, whether it's Ted Hendricks, whether it's Mike Haynes, today on their current roster, Max Crosby, I think, is one of the scariest dudes in the entire league. Same for Robert Spillane at linebacker. This is the toughness that Tommy exuded in his Ohio State career. Guy that played through a dislocated elbow last year is going to fit in well with that organization, which is now his head coach will be a former NFL linebacker. So that fit too makes a lot of sense. And Mike Hall, I thought, was going to be a day 2 steal for a team. I think he's a legitimate first round talent who never got to showcase his full potential at Ohio State because he was not playing his best position consistently. Again, I think the one technique made sense for, Tyleik Williams' emergence at that 3 tech. There's no blame for me that he was playing the 1 tech. I think that's how he saw the field. That's where it made the most sense to play him for Ohio State. But at the next level, he's clearly a 3 tech. And I think the athletic traits, the insane 40-yard dash time, 4.75 for a D tackle that's crazy, right? But all the strength and power, the explosiveness and burst that you can see on tape with him, I think not only that, but then you put him in his hometown organization. This is a guy who's from the Cleveland area. So there is a great fit, I think, with all of these picks and the destination. And the destination is so important with the draft. And we talked about it before, too. A guy going to Las Vegas, just to make one more point on Tommy, you sometimes worry about, what they could get into. It is the Sin City after all. Lots of distractions. I think if there's anyone that you look at and say, I don't think Vegas will be a problem for him, it's Tommy Eichenberg. I mean, just as dedicated a guy to the game and avoiding distractions and being down to earth as it gets. So for me, I think all of these landing spots worked out pretty well for Ohio State players. And now, as far as the guys that get drafted go, it'll be about earning a role with the team.
Yeah, as Raiders general manager Tom Telesco said, Tommy is all ball all the time. And that's a good quality to have when you're worried about eliminating some of those distractions that can come with playing in Las Vegas. As for Ohio State's undrafted free agents, Josh Proctor signed with the Jacksonville Jaguars, Xavier Johnson signed with the Buffalo Bills, Steel Chambers with the Detroit Lions, and Matthew Jones with the Miami Dolphins. Mayan Williams remains unsigned. Likely because he's still recovering from the knee surgery that he had back in January. Not totally surprising that he hasn't been signed yet, because I think a lot of teams are probably sitting out there waiting and saying, well, when you're healthy, we'll bring you in for a tryout. But, a team doesn't necessarily want to use one of its roster spots right now on a guy who, isn't even able to go through a rookie minicamp because he's still recovering from that knee injury. He said he hoped he'd be cleared in time for training camp, but I'd imagine that a lot of teams just want to wait and see on his health before bringing him in. And so hopefully he will get a shot here at some point later this summer once he is cleared to play. But, out of those four guys who have signed, the question now becomes, who can make a roster out of those guys? Because, we have seen it before. Certainly examples of undrafted free agents who have gone on to have successful NFL careers. You look at Ronnie Hickman this past year for the Cleveland Browns. He went on to start 4 games as a rookie. He even had a pick 6 in the Browns' playoff clinching win over the New York Jets. And so going undrafted is not a death sentence. It does create an uphill battle for those guys. But those guys are still capable of potentially carving out NFL careers. I've banged the table for Xavier Johnson before. I still think Xavier Johnson is going to be on an NFL roster this fall. I think the Buffalo Bills were a team that needed wide receiver help going into this draft. They did draft Keon Coleman with the 33rd pick, but I think there could certainly be an opportunity there for Xavier Johnson to earn a roster spot as that 5th receiver / 3rd running back / kickoff returner / special teams hybrid with all of his versatility that he has. I'm still, even though he went undrafted, I still think we're going to see Xavier Johnson on an NFL roster this fall. Andy, who do you like out of those guys to, maybe have the best chance to make a roster?
Well, since he didn't get drafted, I think Josh Proctor would be my first choice. I think there's whatever, what they're going to find out there when he gets to Jacksonville is that this is a legit guy who sees the game well, who has the athletic traits you need. All those things we've said about Josh Proctor before. I think he will have a really good shot to make a roster. And a lot of this, too, is your ability to contribute on special teams, honestly. I think a lot of football fans chuckle at that, but it's true when you're talking about filling out the bottom of an NFL roster, trying to just be one of the 53. Special teams becomes really important because they need guys that can relieve the starters, obviously, and play those special teams roles to give them a break. And so when you're filling out the depth of a roster, it's definitely something that NFL teams look at very heavily. That's why I think Josh Proctor and then Xavier Johnson would be my second choice, to your point that Xavier can do so much in terms of special teams contributions, doing those sorts of things. Steel Chambers has the athleticism to do some of that too. So we'll see. But I think as far as like undrafted guys that have the best shots to make rosters this fall, I think those would be my two picks, are Josh Proctor and Xavier Johnson.
Now, there's already a lot of excitement for what Ohio State's 2025 NFL draft class should be. And, we knew going into this year's draft, it was not going to be the most prolific draft for Ohio State because of all the guys who came back for another year at Ohio State. And, because we're now, finally getting into that point where, these guys who are going to be seniors next year don't have that COVID year of extra eligibility. There's a lot of guys who we know are going to be in the draft next year who look like very good bets, in some cases locks to be drafted. I mean, I think there's 8 seniors, true seniors, in Denzel Burke, Emeka Egbuka, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Travion Henderson, Tyleik Williams, Donovan Jackson, Jordan Hancock. I would fully expect all of those guys to be drafted. So that's 8 players right there. Then you've got a group of 7 fifth-year guys who I think are all a little bit more borderline, but could be drafted. I think probably out of that group, the guy who I think is in the best position to be drafted right now would be Lathan Ransom. You've got Ty Hamilton and Cody Simon, who are guys who I think, if they have big years, could get themselves drafted. I don't know if they would be drafted right now, but I think if they have big years that they're capable of, they could certainly be drafted a year from now. You've got Seth McLaughlin and Josh Fryer, who I don't think would be drafted right now, but again, if they can have a good year, can certainly give themselves a chance. I think the same is true for G. Scott Jr. at tight end. And then, probably a wild card is Will Howard, who's a guy who, as a quarterback in a draft class next year that does not look nearly as strong at quarterback as this year's was, if he could have a great year, it's certainly possible he could make a big move up draft boards. As of right now, I'm not sure he would be drafted, like just based on what he was as a passer at Kansas State and what we saw this spring. I wouldn't sit here right now and say that, Will Howard is a surefire draft pick, but there's certainly the potential there if he can have a great year for Ohio State, that he can get himself drafted and potentially make a big move up the board. And so, there's 15 guys right there who are seniors in one form or another. A couple of those fifth years still have a 6th year because of a COVID year. But, if we just kind of assume, those guys will move on after this year right now, just for hypothetical purposes, there's 15 guys there that are kind of in a senior group that should be on the NFL radar. And then you've got a few guys who could, also enter that draft pool. I think of the juniors, I think the 2 guys you'd really look at as the most likely candidates to be in the draft next year are those Ole Miss transfers, Quinshon Judkins and Davison Igbinosun. I've already seen some mock drafts that have Quinshon Judkins as a potential first-round pick, and so you would think he's a strong candidate to go pro after just 1 year at Ohio State. Davison Igbinosun as well. He's going into his 3rd year as a starter. If he can continue building off of what he did last year, I think he's certainly somebody who could be an early to middle round pick. You've got Josh Simmons, who Ohio State technically lists as a senior, but he's really a redshirt junior in terms of eligibility. He's got 2 years left. He's a guy who, if you're looking at offensive linemen who could emerge, his upside as a draft prospect is higher than a Josh Fryer or Seth McLaughlin, because he is an elite athlete. So if he can take a jump in his play this year, he's certainly a guy, right now, I don't know that he would be drafted, but I think if he can make a big jump in his play, he's a guy who has the potential to make a big move up draft boards. And then, you've also got Sonny Styles and CJ Hicks, who, right now I would look at those 2 and say that I think, most likely they're going to still be at Ohio State in 2025. But, these are 2 guys who are 5-star recruits in their class. It's certainly not out of a question that one of those 2 guys could have a huge year this year and make himself into an early round draft prospect. And so that's 20 guys right there who, should be on the radars of NFL scouts going into this year. Now, I'm personally not buying the talk of Ohio State breaking the all-time NFL draft record right now, because I think that's rooted in the idea that basically all of those guys are going to get drafted. And, we just had the conversation about guys like Josh Proctor and Steel Chambers, who were multi-year starters for Ohio State. I think it's very easy at this time of year to make the assumption of, every Ohio State starter is going to get drafted. But that doesn't happen. Like it's very rare. I mean, it might have happened at Georgia a couple years ago, where basically every starter in the draft got drafted. But it's very rare that it actually comes together that way. And I think there are a lot of guys, particularly in that fifth year group, to where there's some projection that needs to happen. There's some things they need to show that they have not shown yet in their careers if they are going to get themselves drafted. And so I do think with all of those guys, I think certainly next year should be one of Ohio State's most prolific drafts ever. I expect that Ohio State will have double-digit draft picks. I think it could challenge its school record of 14 picks. I think it could certainly have a shot to top Michigan's 13 picks this year. But when I look at that 16 number that Ohio State would have to get to tie Georgia's record, I think that's still a little lofty right now. I think that really banks on everything breaking right for Ohio State's draft prospects. And so, if that was where you were putting the over-under, I would take the under right now.
Yeah. I think there's a lot that has to break right, to your point. What I do think is there's going to be a lot more, it's going to be a lot more toward the top of the NFL draft, and guys taken in the first 2 days. I think there's, you mentioned, the confidence they clear double-digit draft picks. I think they could get close to double digits in the first 2 days, looking at who could go pro and talking about who is kind of in that day 1, day 2 range. Really, a lot of the 8 seniors that you mentioned between Denzel Burke, Emeka Egbuka, Jack Sawyer, JT Tuimoloau, Travion Henderson, Tyleik Williams, Donovan Jackson, and Jordan Hancock, I think all 8 of those guys have first 2-day potential. Some of them might need to show more to get there. Some of them I think are already there in Emeka's case, in Denzel's case, maybe some others, but those are all guys with that first 2-day potential. And so this is going to be, next year's draft class is going to have a lot of picks toward the top of the draft for Ohio State, I think. And that would be a huge statement. Obviously, when you see a lot of guys get drafted, there tends to be a little bit of a boost for recruits who see that. Those are the kinds of things that can help just put more recognition on what your program is doing to develop players. But there's a lot of things they want to accomplish in college first, of course. So I think that's, for now, that's more important to these guys than thinking about what their draft stock is going to be next year. Obviously, for us as prognosticators, it's easy to talk about and think about, well, yeah, they could have a lot of guys drafted next year. It might not be as many as people are saying right now. And I think this year served as evidence of that when you look at some of the guys who didn't get drafted, who I think we expect to get drafted, even outside Josh Proctor. I think you thought there might be a team that spent a 7th round pick on Xavier Johnson or Steel Chambers or Matt Jones and just took a swing at one of those guys. So to see how this year kind of unfolded, a lot of guys who you look at, I think some people look at and say, yeah, that guy will get drafted. They're overestimating, I think, what it takes or how easy it is to be an NFL draft pick after being, a major contributor at Ohio State. It's not a given because there's a lot of good college football players out there. And you're competing with dudes from multiple classes. So it's not always so cut and dry to get drafted. I think Styles and Hicks, though, with their athletic traits, are certainly candidates, if either of them has a huge breakout season, to join that draft class. And it'll be interesting to see exactly how much roster turnover there is outside of the guys that exhaust their eligibility next season for Ohio State. Obviously, they were able to retain so many NFL draft pieces, guys who had NFL draft stock for this season. But that's because of I think a lot of that was because of the motivation factors of losing to Michigan a third year in a row, not achieving the goals that this team felt it was capable of in 2023. And so where will they sit coming into next year, the 2025 NFL draft? Because you're going to either one of two things is going to be the case, right? It's either you achieved what you set out to achieve, you avenged the Michigan stuff, you avenged not winning the Big Ten title, you maybe even won a national title, and so you're not going to have those same motivating factors, or you failed to achieve all that, but the guys who came back to do it another year are all out of eligibility. So I don't expect next year to be a huge retention year. Obviously, it can't be because of the guys that are running out of eligibility, but even like some of those borderline guys who are like maybe could go, maybe could stay, I'm not sure I expect as many of them to come back next year. Again, looking way ahead here, but as many of them to come back next year because there's not going to be as much of that motivating force to do so in either case. All that being said, I do think that if Ohio State gets to that level and perhaps wins a national title, perhaps guys that need to step up to get to that point, they could challenge Georgia's record, but it's not as cut and dry as, even I thought maybe at first, or what's been said by people that just, people out there looking ahead to what next year's draft could be.
Yeah, I don't know if I totally agree with the idea that, nobody's going to want to come back a year from now. Because I think if you just look across the college football landscape in general, it's becoming more common for guys to stay in school for 4 years. And NIL plays a big part in that. But I think to some ways, this past year should kind of show us, like, we need to recalibrate our expectations a bit of this idea that, like, every star player is going to be gone after 3 years, because you're seeing more and more. I think more and more guys are looking at it. It's like, if I'm a surefire first round pick, I'm going to go. But if I'm not, then a lot more guys are becoming inclined to stay. And some of that is really because of the fact that if you don't get that first round money and you're getting good NIL money in college, the gap there is maybe not that big anymore. And so I think, certainly that played a big factor in guys like Denzel Burke and Jack Sawyer, Emeka Egbuka, JT Tuimoloau, you name it, staying in school for another year. And you think about all those guys are going to be out the door. That's going to free up a lot more NIL money next year for retaining some of your other pieces. So again, that's a conversation for 8 months down the road. But I think that, I'm not going to assume anything about anybody in terms of that next class not being back beyond this year, because there's a lot of guys that we're talking about in that class for next year that at this time a year ago, we would have guessed would already be in the NFL right now, that we would have been talking about in that 2024 draft class. And to your point, certainly some of those decisions are going to be shaped by whatever happens this year. And, I think that's part of where some of that record talk comes from is, if you're a fan, you want to be optimistic that, hey, all these guys are going to be great and we're going to win a national championship. And that could happen. But I think, to your point, sometimes it gets forgotten at this point of the year just how hard it is to get drafted. I mean, I look at a guy like Cody Schrader, who was a Doak Walker Award finalist, who shredded Ohio State in the Cotton Bowl, and he did not get drafted. Like, there are really good college football players who don't get drafted every year. So for some of these guys, there's going to be a jump that needs to take place this year to get themselves drafted. And that's why I say I think these projections about breaking the record, I think are a little bit overly optimistic, but I do think it's going to be a prolific draft class next year. To your point, I think certainly multiple first-round picks are very much in play. I think, for me personally, right now, the two guys who I'm most bullish on as draft prospects out of that group are Denzel Burke and Jack Sawyer. I see no reason why, if Denzel Burke continues to play the way he did last year, that he should not be a first-round pick. I think if Jack Sawyer plays the way he played down the stretch of last season, that he should be a first-round pick. I think certainly if Emeka Egbuka returns to a form we saw from 2 years ago, I think he's going to be very much in that first-round conversation. JT Tuimoloau as well as a guy, I think you still want to see him take that next step and really become a dominant player on a consistent basis. But I think if he can do that, he can be a first-rounder as well. Trayvion's a guy where it's like 10 years ago, I'd probably be more confident he'd be a first-round pick than now, just because we don't see as many first-round running backs anymore. But I do think that he will safely be in that day 2 conversation. And a lot of those other guys as well. Tyleik Williams certainly has early round upside. I think Donovan Jackson, we need to see a little bit more out of him this year than we did last year, as that offensive line struggled as a whole. But if he can take that next step, he certainly has that early round potential as well. Then, Jordan Hancock's going to be an interesting guy. I don't necessarily see him as a first round pick because of the position he plays as that nickel corner. A lot of times those guys are less inclined to be first round picks, but I think a day 2 pick is certainly within reach for him.
Yeah, I'd agree with all those assessments. And, I think I said it before that it's an interesting mix of guys in that senior class that are either right there in the first round conversation or guys you expect to be day 2 picks, or at least getting consideration for that day 2 spot. I think the need for nickel corners, to the point about Jordan Hancock, the need for nickel corners has increased over the past few years just with how prolific NFL passing offenses have gotten. So many NFL defenses now are pivoting to either more multiple schemes or even 4-2-5. That's what my Bengals run. They run a 4-2-5 on defense and have had some really good nickels. Mike Hilton in recent years, they're at that nickel spot. Guys, it's become a pretty important position for NFL defenses. So that has ticked up. But at the same time, not every defense uses a nickel. So that's why you're going to see less likelihood of a first-round selection. But I think very viable that a high-quality nickel corner, nickel safety, whatever you want to call it, is taken in day 2. I think there's a lot of teams that will be looking for that spot, or at least have that spot as part of their defense, and maybe want to build depth, whatever the case may be. And then Jordan can also, be a factor on the outside. I think that's what, you look at him, that's what he was recruited as. He's played that in spots at Ohio State, even last year. So he's got outside capabilities too. And so I think Jordan is one of the more intriguing draft prospects, really, just in terms of how he fits, where he could go relative to his position for Ohio State coming into next year. And, I just like discussing exactly how that fits. But at the end of the day, I do think next year is going to be a big special draft class for Ohio State. How big and special is the question? And to your point, I do think, yes, NIL has opened avenues to get guys to stay. I just think there's other factors beyond NIL too that, there's going to be decisions made next year that I don't expect every guy who has eligibility left that had a big year to go, but I think a few more could than this year, where they really retain almost everyone that outside of Mike Hall, really, that was not a senior that could have gone pro. So, and had this huge list of guys. I just don't think it's going to be as crazy next year, but they very well, I think they will retain at least some of those pieces that were really good in year 3, maybe, and come back for year 4.
Well, and the reality is, most of the starters this year are going to be seniors. So most of those guys are going to be gone, but there's not going to be like that many opportunities for guys who aren't seniors this year to, when we talk specifically juniors, because some of those non-senior starters are going to be guys like Caleb Downs and Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate who aren't draft eligible. So it's going to be a pretty small group, and this might be a conversation for another podcast about kind of where that junior class stands, because there's a lot of guys there that are going to have to wait really until their senior year to really play starting roles for this team. And so that's going to be a factor in that as well. But, to your point, lots of interesting decisions to come in 8 months. And, I agree with you on Jordan Hancock. I'm guessing there's probably not a lot of Mike Sainristil fans on this podcast, but he's a guy who just went in the second round of the NFL draft, kind of that prototypical nickel corner after a great career that he had at Michigan. I think Jordan Hancock could have a similar appeal to teams if he can have the kind of senior year that he should be capable of for the Buckeyes. And so the transfer portal's closed. The draft is over, but still plenty of football talk to come here on Real Pod Wednesdays over the course of the rest of the offseason. That said, we will not have a show next week. Andy's going to be in Costa Rica. I've got some vacation time coming up this next week as well. And so we are going to take the week off next week, but we will be back in 2 weeks for another episode of Real Pod Wednesdays. And make sure you stay tuned with 11warriors.com. If there's any transfer additions on either football, basketball side, any other news that you need to be aware of, our team will have it covered over 11warriors.com. So thanks for listening in, and we'll catch up with you again soon.